out there, and welcome to Answers for Today. My name is Bill Wynn, and I'm here in Studio G with Pastor Terry Reynolds from Agape Chapel and Chris Quintana from Old Path, Calvary Old Path. I always kind of get it monkeyed up, but I was close that time. It's a name change. Those things happen. So the topic today is one that I think is interesting to everybody. And we always say that Christianity is completely different from all other, quote, religions. And we always say that it's about a relationship, not a religion. And so what we'd like to talk about, and kind of the question we want to ask today is it possible for man to walk in fellowship with the creator of the universe, with God? And an interesting question, and we believe that the answer is fundamental to the truths of Christianity. And actually, you guys, I'm sure will agree, it's one of those many things, actually, that set Christianity apart from all other faiths, be they, quote, a religion or a relationship or whatever it is. I mean, this is what makes what we believe in unique, different, and actually it's what makes it work. Yes. Because it's not about man, right? No. It's about what God can do in your life. So, having said that, I'll let you answer the question, Terry. Can a man fellowship with God?
I believe absolutely that the Bible teaches that, but what I like to do is kind of work it backwards a little bit. You know, you like using that reverse engineering type of way of looking at things, and really to take a look at what the Bible has to say. And where do you start? The writer of Hebrews, chapter 11, and Chris, I'd like to start with this. He says, without faith it's impossible to believe him. This is Hebrews 11:6. For he that cometh to God, in order to have fellowship with him, first must believe that he is, and then secondly, he's a rewarder to those who diligently seek him. So the real thing that the writer of Hebrews was saying is that we need to first admit that the God of the Bible exists, if I understand right. You were just spent some time with a wonderful man, Russ Miller, that in his creation research, he really lays it out from a biblical perspective that the God of the Bible in Genesis actually is real, that we can count on. And so coming to a place where you believe the Bible, but also the God of the Bible, I think is really what the writer of Hebrews is saying, is that we believe it. So Chris, why don't you get us going? And with this, we're seeing that we must believe that he is.
Yeah, I had to chuckle because I didn't know where you were going to start and everything else. I was already open to that verse.
Oh, were you really?
Yeah. Because here's what's funny. You read verse 6. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. It's a straightforward statement, right? And it says, for whoever comes to him has to first of all believe that he exists, but that he's also a rewarder of those who diligently seek after him. So notice that a relationship is something that was initiated by God and not by us. Because verse 5 is the part right before it. Says, by faith Enoch was taken away, and he did not see death. And he was found because he was not found, rather, because he had been taken by God. And before he was taken, he had this testimony, that he pleased God.
Wow.
So if having a relationship wasn't possible, then that makes no sense. If it wasn't possible, then the three of us don't sit at this table. If it wasn't possible, there's nobody on the other end of this hearing it or watching it. So if it wasn't possible that man could have a relationship, then there's no context to why we would get together or why we would have a testimony. His testimony, we didn't get a chance to talk with him, but the testimony is this. He was pleasing to God so much so that God took him from the earth alive.
Wow.
And he never saw physical death. He's one of two guys in the Old Testament that you could say that of. He and Elijah, that's it. They still couldn't have gone into the very presence or the throne room of God. Sin had not been atoned for. But these guys never saw death. They went to that place that we called the bosom of Abraham or paradise when Jesus talked to the man on the cross. That until atonement could be done and resurrection takes place and all of those things were taken care of, these men were just simply taken from the earth in a place of of keeping until Jesus set them free.
So the idea of the existence of God, and what the Bill in Genesis 1, it says, in the beginning God, that's really at the heart of everything we believe in. So a question I have, why is biblical creation so important to us, and why is Genesis, we seem to be, as Christians, I'm saying from the outside looking at us, that we're kind of narrow-minded in our thinking, right? And that we believe that there was a biblical creation, and thus there was how we were created was created by God. And so why don't you help us with understanding this?
Well, and I think what happens is that people get confused about cause and effect. And people, a person who believes in evolution will believe that certain things can happen without necessarily having a cause.
Mm-hmm.
That things can occur through random events, right? So, if you're in a room full of mosquitoes, sooner or later you will be bitten enough times by the mosquitoes so that they will create a little heart-shaped thing of bites, right?
That's a terrible
I
thought.
know. Yeah. But that's how silly you have to be to believe in evolution. It's like, well, I'm going to let the mosquitoes keep on biting me until I get the shape that I want or that I need to have, till it will allow the next stage of creation. Mm-hmm. Okay, so in other words, the classic phrase is, from the goo to the zoo to you type thing, and that, we came from some primordial soup that had some special little paramecium or something in it that eventually evolved into what is human. Now, I would say some people are further back in the evolution stream, if you buy that, than others, but it's not how it works. And if you step back and you just think about all this as a cause and effect process, and you also understand that, for something to have occurred, there had to be a cause, okay? Yes. And if we work backwards to everything that we can see or know, the universe, in other words, what our known universe, there had to be a first cause of that, because we know that it exists. It's like this pen. I know that this exists because I can touch it and hold it and I can see it. But you know what? Something had to create that. Yes. And it didn't just evolve, okay? And I would suggest that, mankind, in all its craziness, is more complex than this pen. So for me to think that mankind could just spontaneously show up somewhere is pure ludicrousness. And it's like, I think that everybody who believes in evolution that teaches that at the university level has to walk around the engineering building to get to that place. Because if you really were a true scientist, you'd sit down, and an engineer would sit down and say, okay, well, what if this happens, what happens, And they would realize that it's virtually statistically, physically, time-wise, all the variables required for evolution to work aren't there. Not one of them is there. And that's why they keep saying, well, the Earth is so old, because they need more time, because evolution is so small. You don't see it. It creeps along. And I think that what the essence of what we're saying here, and I'm sorry my answer is kind of long, I get carried away on this topic, but when you look at that verse in Hebrews 11:6, and you look down towards where he says, he cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder. Okay, well, that word "he is" that's in there comes from the word nosko.
Yeah.
So what that means is that you have to know, not only in your mind, because what I just kind of gave you was a mental, an intellectual shoot down of evolution. That's one thing. To just look at it and say on its face it's impossible. The other thing is to actually know in your heart, and to know by experience, that God created everything, and that, including us, and that we were all created for his purpose. And that's where that word gnosko comes from. That's where we get the word agnostic, which is to say they believe God exists, but they don't think you can know him.
Means they know nothing.
Yeah.
They
Right.
means
Exactly.
So
That's
Chris,
true.
Chris, what Bill was saying, would you say that it's reasonable that a man can know that God exists? Then, from the biblical creation view, is it something that it's more than a myth? It's more than a theory. I'm looking at an article written. What is the intellectual design theory? They like to put it as a theory rather than a fact. And so help us sort through this a little bit.
Let's play with words. You asked if it's reasonable. I would say that reason demands that conclusion, because there's no other way of explaining away, like what Bill was talking about, the sheer engineering of life as we know it, and what it takes to sustain life as we think about it. So that's why we don't have humans tripping around all the other planets in the solar system. They couldn't sustain life. This one does, and it's unique. And for all of those reasons, or the biology, as he had mentioned with the pen, nobody looks at that and think it happened on its own. It has writing on it, for crying out loud. So if that was the case, that if you're going to believe that evolution is true, then you should be able to see it in all of the observable world. Yet, what you see in things like this, or the computer that's there, or the book that's here, it obviously has somebody who made it. So everywhere that you look outside of evolution, which is a theory, but they claim it to be fact, you don't find evidence for things happening randomly that have information and are able to do the things that the human body, or anything that's biological, it doesn't just happen on its own. That's why they've never been able to reproduce it.
Guys, one of the reasons that I wanted to bring this up is because it really does impact our whole society, is this idea that God doesn't exist. They come up with this evolution theory that are taught in our schools from kindergarten all the way up, and it affects our society. So it really comes down to a choice that we as people are watching is, we assume that most of them are Christians, or if you're non-Christian, which what like they were saying, is that we have to make a choice either to follow a line of thought that like you said, from the goos to the ooze to the zoo and everything else that they have for us, or to take the biblical account of what creation is. And so, Bill, help us again. You just came back from Colorado. You're still telling us the story. As you stood on this cliff of this mountain, overlooking the range and the mountains, you were standing in awe of the evolutionary theory, right? Or wrong?
Absolutely not. I like a couple places, and I think it has to do with the fact that this is my theory now. This is opinion. This is not biblical, but I think that a lot of people crowd to the coast, like in California, so they can look at a place where there aren't any people. So they can look out at the ocean and see, this place is bigger than just, the 405 freeway. And it's the same way with the mountains. I think people flock to the mountains and to what God's created to see and get a sense of awe for how magnificent and how huge and how powerful and how omnipotent and how amazing, God is. And you can see it through his creation. And from the tiniest little thing, little ant on the trail, to the high mountains that are, tons and tons and millions of tons of earth that got put in that spot in just such a way so that the creeks would work and the fish could grow.
Yes.
And it's just one of those things where if you sit back and think of the complexity of life on earth, and if you study at all human like biology, or the whole DNA structure, or proteins that cause maladies in humans, and all of the intricate parts that have to fit together perfectly.
Yeah.
And if there's one flaw anywhere in that coding or that imprint as it's passed down, then you have a mutation which eventually goes off and doesn't survive. So you just can't help but get to a place where you have to acknowledge that something caused all this. And that's this whole concept of, for things to exist, they have to, they had to be caused by something. And God is what we call the first causer, the initial cause of everything. And when he spoke in Genesis, that's when it began. And so, and that isn't something that's, doesn't take a great deal of faith to believe that. It just takes a little bit of common sense, I think, to believe that. Then you get into the discussion about, okay, well, what are the fruit from this creation, and what's God's plan for man, as we know?
That leads me into my next question to you guys, and maybe I'll direct it to Chris. How do beliefs about creation impact the rest of our theology, the way we think?
Sure.
That really affects the church, doesn't it?
Without question. As Bill was just saying, or better yet, let's use our friend Russ Miller. We've already mentioned him. Russ is really good about laying this out as an opening principle. We all have the same facts, or the same evidence, rather. Everybody can look at the creation as it is, and they come to some kind of a conclusion. The prevailing thought within science, because it wants to believe in a godless cause, will say random. There's nothing personal about it. It's completely impersonal. It's just random. And so, of course, that whole theory is really wanting. But then you would have the other groups of people that we would call religious or philosophical that would say, no, there's a cause. And so each of the religions has their explanation of how they came to be, kind of.
Yeah.
What you find in the biblical narrative is a real explanation for it with vivid detail, and it's God recounting why and how and the processes of what he did to create it. So then everybody has to take that look at the same evidence and draw a conclusion from it. The religions of the world outside of Christianity and outside of Judaism, using the Bible, don't have a real viable explanation from their God that says, here's how I did what I did and why.
When you look at their doctrines and teachings.
Yes, exactly. But read their literature, or read their sacred writings, whatever you want to call it, they're lacking in detail. And even from the best of them, grossly lacking in detail. The one thing that you have here in Genesis is so detailed that some people have a problem with it.
Yeah.
Because it's so detailed.
So accurate.
So, sure. And it refutes evolution immediately in the first chapter when it said God made these things on this day and he made them after their own kind. Period. End of subject. So God's not looking to get involved in a debate. He's just saying, this is what I did. Now, you can believe it or not. And that's where faith comes in, which we've already talked about. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. Because you have to, first of all, determine whether or not you believe that he is. And the rewarder of those who diligently seek him is that he's going to give you the answers to your questions, including the the creation of all things.
So it does affect, go ahead, Bill.
Well, I was just going to say, the other thing that's so cool about all this is that from an engineering perspective and from a true science perspective, it all makes sense. Because if you look at the order in which God created things, he created them in the only order that would be possible for a creator to do it. So first he creates energy, right?
Yeah.
and then he creates matter, okay? And then he creates, he eventually creates, let's say, living things, but everything except for man in his own image. So it's a totally logical, God's a great engineer. He figured all this out, and he said, okay, this is how we're going to do this, and he just spoke it into existence. And so when you look back at the different accounts of how everything got started, this is the only way that makes any scientific or technical or common sense. I heard a thing the other day that, everybody says, well, the Big Bang. Well, all you have to do is ask a Big Bang person, well, what happened a millisecond before the bang happened? how did this infinitesimal point of mass get created in the
Yeah.
first place? I heard a thing the other day that now they've seen so many holes in that theory that, you can shoot holes in it, as big as drive a truck through them. Now they've decided that there's more than one Big Bang.
Well, they got to come up with something. right?
Yeah, so now we've got multiple Big Bangs out there. But wait a second.
They
I
still
thought
don't
that
answer.
everything was created in the first one. Well, how can you have a second one? Well, because it's the only way we can explain, this part of the universe. And so they just, it's just coming up with theories that lets the math work. And it's not based in reality. It's not based, the biggest thing is, in my mind, is it's not based in what you as a person, as an individual thinking person, can visually go look at and see. Because to me, that's the evidence. It's the eyewitness of what God's creation is, and that's what gets you to the place where you go, whoa, this just didn't happen by itself.
One of the things I like about the Bible, where it declares who God is, and one of the part that it says is that God is a God of order. And just like you were saying, there was an order and a designer to the universe, the way in the biblical account of creation. I think of the order of the universe. When you go out there and stand there in Colorado up the ridge and you see all the stars up there, why aren't they running into each other? Why are there perfectly distanced between each other where the gravitational pull doesn't cause them just to blow up? And it's just a designer, and so I guess what my question was, does this biblical creation, is it important as it affects our thinking? And because I believe there's many people that want to stay away from the Genesis account, like they want to stay away from the book of Revelation, the two bookends that they don't want to teach, they don't want to understand. Chris, why is that? Why do people, or pastors, I guess, stay away from the creation account and saying exactly what Bill just talked about there?
Sure, because they will feel it's too difficult to defend. So that ultimately becomes a problem with them and not a problem with the information. Because, again, even in the other religions, if they really believe that there's a God who's responsible for the creation, then you take a look around at the vastness of it. And you'll find that every single one of those other belief systems doesn't really believe in a personal God. That becomes he can be so grand as to have created everything that you see, but so deeply personal that he would communicate directly with an individual. That's unique. I mean, no other one is like that, and it's why I went back to Genesis. Oddly enough, and chapter 12 is where we get now. The Lord said to Abram. So it's a two-way conversation with only two participants, God and Abraham. Abram at the time just means exalted father. If people want to know why is he Abram or Abraham? Abram, exalted father. Abraham, father of multitudes. Okay. So get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, and through you all the generations of man, the families of earth, will be blessed. Jew and Gentile alike. Fast forward quickly, just a couple of chapters to chapter 15, and after these things, 25 years plus, these things, the Lord said to Abram in a vision, do not be afraid, I am your shield and your exceedingly great reward.
Wow. Man
to man, if you would, God to man. But Abram said, Lord God, what is it that you will give me, seeing that I am without an heir in my house? The only guy I've got is Eliezer of Damascus. Well, so anyway, here's what God ends up doing. Verse 5, and he brought him outside, and he said, look towards the heaven and count the stars if you are able, and number them. And he said to him, so will your descendants be. And it says he, Abram, believed in the Lord, and he accounted it to him as righteous. That's the faith thing. Without faith, it's impossible to believe, or it's impossible to be pleasing to God. In a case like this, he didn't even have an heir. He was promised, decades before, you're going to be a blessing to the nations, and yet he had no heir.
Wow.
So again, it's personal.
So we see what we saw so far. We just briefly touched on. The evidence is overwhelming, Bill, that there is a creator. There is, as the writer of Hebrews said, is that we must come to a place to believe that God is. And once and what Chris just said is comes to a faith, a choice that we have to make. And we have a few minutes left. Why don't you talk about that choice that people have laid before them even today?
Well, and I think it's sometimes good to think of it like we talk about a step of faith, right? And we've talked many times in the apologetics class and all that about the bridge diagram, about how God's over here and man's over here, and Jesus is the bridge and the way and the pathway to have a relationship with God. And we will talk more about that. And in no way do I mean to reduce what Jesus did, because he basically created a whole new covenant for mankind. But if you are realistic with yourself, and if you are honest with yourself, I've read a couple things lately where the first thing that man has to learn how to do is to be honest with himself. And if you sit down in the mirror and you look at yourself in the mirror and you ask yourself, how did I get here? Was this something where I just came up out of the primordial ooze? Or was I actually part of what God created? And if you really think about that and ask yourself honestly, you have to come to the place where you believe that you came from the Creator in some way. God had a hand in you getting there. And as a result of that step that you have to take to bridge the gap between God and man, it's not a big step, okay? Because I believe actually Jesus moved the two edges closer together, because he gave the evidence of the fact that God had omnipotence over everything, including death. And so to me, the creation argument is fundamental, and I'm sure we're going to talk in the next segment about what it does to society if you don't have that sense of who created us and why we're here and where we're going and what the consequences are if we don't go the right direction.
Chris, you have about 30 seconds.
I'm glad that you ended on that, because that's perfect. We're discussing something that people want to talk about as though it's a here and now discussion. It's how you answer that here and now discussion that has eternal ramifications. That's what matters.
Right.
It is possible for you to walk with God. It really comes down to your choice. Do you believe that he exists? If so, then you need to listen to what the words that he had to say. Next week, we're going to talk about how you too can have fellowship with God, but don't wait till next week. Just call upon him even this day, and you'll start that beautiful walk with Jesus Christ. On behalf of Chris and Bill, this is Terry. May God richly bless you.
About this broadcast, or if you have any questions, feel free to mail us at Agape Chapel OC, P.O. Box 4023, Huntington Beach, California, 92647. Or you can email us at aft@agapechapelOC.org. Or visit our website at agapechapelOC.org. Until next time,